It was Iowa, late summer of 1944. The air held that mix of corn dust and diesel from trucks that never seemed to stop at the depot. Camp Algona spread across the flat fields like a squared-off patch of order, barbed wire glinting against the sunrise. At twilight, the place looked gentler, soft light on watchtowers, shadows slipping between barracks. That was when Sergeant Paul Henderson began his rounds. He always started from the north gate, same time, same slow pace, same nod to the men he passed. His boots scuffed the gravel in a rhythm everyone could tell apart from the others. Inside the wire, German prisoners moved in quiet groups, finishing chores before lights out. Some leaned on rakes, others lined up to fill canteens from a barrel. The air carried that low hum of men who had spent a day laboring on farms miles away and were too tired for trouble. Henderson would pass by, hand resting on the stock of his carbine, but his eyes on the horizon rather than on them. And every night, as the floodlights blinked to life, he would tip his cap, not a salute, not command, just a gesture halfway between habit and courtesy. The first time he did it, no one answered. A few prisoners stared, unsure, but by the third evening, one of them, a thin man with straw-colored hair, lifted his hand in return, barely more than a twitch. Others followed, tentative at first, as though testing the limits of a rule no one had written. Henderson said nothing. He simply kept walking, kept nodding. The gesture became part of the hour, like the whistle from the kitchen or the clang of the gate chain. Later that week, the camp interpreter mentioned that the Germans called him the man who says good night. The name spread through the compound. Henderson never corrected it. He was 32, had a wife teaching in town, and a brother somewhere in France. At dusk he carried their memory with him, steady, measured steps between two worlds that had collided and somehow settled here on Midwestern soil. One evening, a storm gathered to the west. Clouds rolled over the fields, the light turned copper. The men hurried to finish washing their clothes in the tin basins outside the barracks. Henderson walked his line just as the first drops hit the dust, turning it dark and fragrant. A prisoner dropped his laundry bag and struggled with a flap of canvas. Henderson stepped forward, pressed down the rope with his boot so the man could tie it, then moved on without a word. That night, when the lightning came close, the camp stayed strangely calm. By September, the days shortened. Harvest trucks rumbled past the fences carrying corn, picked by POW labor. Locals sometimes stopped on the road to stare at the men behind wire. Some waved, some didn't. Henderson noticed that the prisoners began to gather near the east fence just before his shift ended, as if waiting for the ritual. He never hurried them back inside unless the siren called for it. The quiet exchange, hat tipped, heads inclined, was enough to mark the passing of another safe day. He once told a fellow guard that the routine helped him remember why he was there, to keep order, yes, but also to keep something decent alive. "You don't let war take your manners," he said, lighting his pipe under the awning as rain drummed the roof. The other man shrugged, not sure if that counted as soldier talk. By October, frost began to form along the fence each morning. The nod became a breath of steam, the sound of boots on frozen gravel. Letters came from Europe, news of heavy fighting, of prisoners taken on both sides. Henderson kept his letters folded in his pocket, unopened till night. Then he would walk, same path, same hat brim, tugged down against the cold. Behind the wire, men waited for that small sign that the day was done, that someone outside still saw them as human. That winter, the habit stayed. Even on Christmas Eve, when wind scraped the floodlight poles and the guards' coats stiffened with ice, he walked his route. The prisoners had strung bits of paper into garlands above their bunks. Some hummed carols. Henderson nodded through the glow of the generator house and the shadows of men who were no longer enemies for that hour. By early January, snow lay in ridges along the camp roads. The guards wrapped scarves around their faces, and the prisoners marched to work in lines that looked like moving fence wire against the white. The cold cut through every layer of wool, but the routine held: breakfast before dawn, trucks leaving for the fields, a bell for evening count. And at dusk, Henderson would walk. He began to notice small things: how the sound of boots changed over snow, how breath hung in the air like smoke from a lamp. The nod had become second nature, almost like clockwork. He didn't think of it as kindness. It was simply the right way to close a day, the same as shutting a gate or checking a lock. But the men noticed. A prisoner once left a small carving near the fence, a bird whittled from a corncob, set just inside the wire. Henderson saw it one morning, turned it over in his hand, then left it on the post. No report filed, no reprimand. Just a silent understanding that some gestures were better left undocumented. In town, people talked. They said the camp was quiet, that the guards had it easy compared to Europe. Some questioned why captured soldiers were treated so well, fed proper meals, paid small wages for farm work. Henderson didn't join those conversations. He spent his free days fixing his truck or writing short letters home, careful not to mention the camp's routine. He didn't see what was worth arguing about. A man's job, he thought, was to keep order without losing himself to it. As winter eased, the landscape softened again. The fields turned muddy and the fence posts leaned a little in the thaw. Henderson's patrols stretched longer, partly out of habit, partly because he enjoyed the quiet before lights out. The prisoners planted flowers along one barrack wall, seeds gathered from last year's corn patches. The guard captain allowed it. Henderson passed them each evening, nodding at the small line of color against the gray boards. One evening he noticed the straw-haired prisoner sitting alone near the garden. The man was sketching in a notebook, coat collar turned up. Henderson paused a few yards away, the way he did when he wanted to be seen, but not intrusive. The prisoner looked up, nodded once, and held up the page, just long enough for Henderson to see a rough drawing of the camp gate framed by tall cornstalks. Then the man tucked it away. No words were exchanged, only the low whine of the wind through the wires. In March, new arrivals came from another state, men captured in the Ardennes. They carried hard expressions, unshaven, suspicious of everything. The older prisoners tried to explain the routines, the gestures, the evening nod. At first the newcomers laughed, yet within a week they too stood near the fence at dusk, uncertain but present, waiting for the guard's slow approach. Henderson did not alter his rhythm. He tipped his cap as always. The laughter faded, replaced by quiet that felt heavier, but somehow steadier. The camp chaplain once remarked that Henderson's route was the calmest part of the day. "You'd think they're waiting for him like church bells," he said. Henderson smiled, not out of pride, but because he liked the sound of that. It meant the pattern had meaning beyond duty. Late that spring, a group of prisoners finished their contract labor and prepared for transfer east. On their last night, they gathered at the fence, close enough for the guards to see, but not close enough to worry anyone. Henderson walked by with his clipboard, called the count, nodded. The straw-haired prisoner stepped forward, hand raised to his brow in a small salute, not military, just farewell. Henderson hesitated, then returned the gesture. When the trucks rolled out the next morning, frost still on the ground, he stood near the gate until they disappeared down the gravel road. The air smelled faintly of diesel and thawing earth. He lit his pipe, felt the wind shift from the west, and walked the perimeter once more. That night, the camp seemed emptier. The sounds were the same: boots, clanging buckets, murmured talk, but the rhythm had changed. Henderson kept his pace, slower now, as if listening for something that had gone missing. Behind the wire, The new men watched him pass, and one of them, not knowing the custom, lifted his hand halfway. Henderson caught the motion and nodded, the same simple gesture that had carried through all those months. By summer, the routine had become legend among the prisoners. Some said the guard's nod brought luck. Others said it meant the war would end soon. Henderson never asked what they believed. He just kept walking as the days grew long again, the same path, the same light at the edge of the fields, the same quiet promise that night would come without harm. The summer of 1945 came heavy with humidity, that slow Iowa heat that bent the air over the corn rows and made every sound stick. Rumors drifted in before the news did, talk of Germany's surrender, of the war ending somewhere far across the ocean. No one said much inside Camp Algona. The guards waited for official orders. The prisoners waited for whatever freedom meant now. Henderson's rounds stayed the same, as though repetition itself held the world steady. On the night the radio confirmed the surrender, the floodlights burned a little brighter. Some of the men inside the wire cheered softly, others sat in silence, unsure if it was joy or loss they felt. Henderson stood by the watchtower stairs, pipe in hand, and watched the lights flicker across the barracks roofs. He thought of his brother overseas, thought of the years folded into letters and miles. Then he set the pipe down and began his walk, the same measured pace, same nod. When he reached the far end of the yard, he noticed something new. Along the fence, a line of paper lanterns, small, made from scraps of ration boxes and bits of cloth, hung between posts. The prisoners had built them, one for each section, candles glowing faintly within. They swayed in the warm wind, throwing gentle light on the wire. Henderson slowed. A few men stood nearby, eyes following his steps. One of them called out quietly in accented English, "Good night, Sergeant." He stopped, looked over the fence, and said back, "Good night, men." It was the first time he'd spoken those words aloud in months of patrols. Then he walked on. Behind him, the lanterns flickered, and for a moment the camp looked less like a prison and more like a town holding vigil for something they all wanted to understand. In the following weeks, the tone of the camp changed. The drills eased, the guards smiled more easily, and the prisoners began to plan their return. Some drew maps of their villages. Others practiced English phrases they would never use again. Henderson oversaw the dismantling of extra fencing, checked supply lists, signed papers that spoke of endings. Still, every evening he walked his line. The habit refused to die before the war did. One afternoon he found the straw-haired prisoner standing by the workshed, a folded note in his hand. The man asked through the interpreter if he could give something to Henderson before leaving. Regulations frowned on gifts, but the captain nodded just once. The prisoner handed him a small envelope. Inside was a sketch, the same drawing of the gate he'd shown months before, now finished, shaded in careful pencil lines. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, it said, "For the man who says good night." Henderson didn't speak. He simply folded the paper, placed it inside his jacket pocket, and shook the man's hand through the open gate before the trucks carried the group away. After the camp emptied that fall, the fences came down. The towers were dismantled, the barracks sold for lumber. What remained were gravel paths leading nowhere, and a few foundation slabs hidden by weeds. Henderson stayed on for a while, overseeing the closure. Each evening, without thinking, he walked the perimeter. There was no wire, no watch, no count, only the field and the wind and the sound of his boots finding the same rhythm they always had. Sometimes locals drove past and slowed to watch. They saw a man walking alone at dusk, head bowed slightly, as if measuring the day's last light. Some thought he was guarding ghosts. Others said he was remembering names. He didn't correct them. By November, orders came to transfer him to a post closer to home. On his last night at Camp Algona, he packed his duffel, stepped outside, and lit his pipe. The field was quiet, the air sharp with frost. He walked once more around the outline of what used to be the fence. The sun had just dipped, and the horizon glowed faintly red. Near where the gate once stood, he paused, looked across the empty space, and tipped his hat one final time. Out beyond the fields, lights from the town began to blink on. Porch lamps, window glows, the kind of small brightness that signaled ordinary life returning. Henderson watched until the last light faded from the sky, then turned toward the road, boots crunching over the gravel in steady, familiar rhythm.